we go. Hello guys, how are you doing? Can you hear me? Yay, wonderful. So I'm going to wait a little bit longer because we've got a lot of people coming on tonight. I think we had over 300 who were keen to turn up. So that's the plan. It's nice to see so many of you from different parts of the world tuning in. It's a dry evening in London, I'm pleased to say, after quite a rainy change. We had a week or two of quarantine in the very brightest sun, which was a wonderful version of quarantine. And in the rain, it's been a little more challenging. But there you go. Who can I recognize in the screens that we have on today? I see some people calling in from Colombia. My regular Colombian visitor is here. I have some people from London, of course. I see some regular faces. I see people who are calling in from the US, from Ireland. Now, guys, you will have access to a chat function on the side. So please do, tell you what, why don't you tell me where you're calling in from if it's somewhere interesting and not London? Go on, give me a little idea of where you're coming from today.
Wow.
Slovenia, love it.
Oh, Brazil.
Pleased to see it. Wayne from Bath, I know that voice. Brazil. Ah, it's really flying. Lagos.
Wow.
From I love it, guys. I attended my child's science lesson the other day, and he was on a kind of big global science call, and the guy doing the call just basically read out everyone's names and where they were from for the first 15 minutes. So we could do that if you like. At least you feel connected. There we go. So if you don't mind waiting a little longer, I have got some music I could play to you, but a bit like lift music whilst you wait for the events to start, but we shall see. Has everyone got a drink? Comfortable seat? Hello, Rob Highland from Dublin. Have you got, I've got an alcohol-free beer because I'm staying focused tonight. Not sponsored, I'm afraid. Actually, I'll be having some of that as we go. Right. So anyone made any good predictions this week? You can tell me in the chat whether any of your predictions have come true. Hello from Atlanta, from Oxford and South Africa. Someone tell me a prediction they've made this week that might have come true. No football, yeah, that's straightforward. Oh, I'm glad to see Margaret is here as well, one of our speakers tonight. So guys, if you're happy to wait just a little bit longer, we'll get to the see if we can get everyone in, and then we will start. Right, good guys. So let's get going. Anna, it's nice to see you again. How are you doing? In a long time. Right, let's get going. So thank you for coming to the Distance Resistance. This is an event that we've run. I think we started it the second week of the lockdown in London, which is, I guess, 6 weeks ago now or something like that. And we ran it because we thought it would be nice to find an opportunity to get people together, frankly, in the times when we were kind of distant. So we were aware that we were apart and we were going to stay apart, but that didn't mean we couldn't come together for a bit of fun and inspiration after work online. And I think we've really discovered that these events have been good for finding new ideas, for meeting people, from just feeling connected, from being somewhere in between work and home and family, but a sort of third space in a way. So it's gone pretty well. And I'm really pleased with how many of you have taken the time to come. So I really appreciate you making the effort to join this event. And, you know, you get out what you put in. So we'll make some good questions and good conversation with our speakers tonight. But I really hope you'll be able to throw in some questions as well as we go. So I'll explain a little bit about how that works. But it's supposed to be fun and informal and relaxed. So please do settle into it and get comfortable. I'm going to introduce our three speakers to you shortly. And then I'm going to get them to answer a bunch of questions which we've developed with some inputs from you. I should tell you that at the end we will then ask you guys if you want to ask questions, which you can do by just popping a question into the chat box, and I will ask you to do so. And then ideally what I'd like to do is get you on screen to ask it. But you should know that we're recording this because there are lots of people who couldn't make it tonight. So if you don't want to have your face on screen, you might have to hide your camera, but I just thought I should tell you that. So I also want to thank Nick from Hyper Ireland, who's been supporting us each week and keeping the technical side of a big Zoom meeting going smoothly, which is, it's hard and it looks. And if ever you've dug into the really detailed settings tabs behind Zoom, you'd be amazed at the amount of things you can control. Anyway, enough of that. So tonight's theme is, can we predict the future? And I'm pleased to tell you that this is the event we've run with the biggest take up. So there's clearly something that chimes in the theme. And I know you can't, we both know you can't really predict the future with certainty. And I'm sure not many of you would have predicted the level of disruption that was coming from COVID-19, even if you were aware at some point that pandemics were coming. But I heard a radio program about that was made in 2007 predicting exactly this, but not quite how and when, and maybe not to the level of the magnitude that we've experienced. So we know you can't predict the future with certainty, but you can prepare for it. And you can increase your ability to be adaptable. And one of the sessions we ran a few weeks ago was about dealing with personal crisis and transformation. And what we learned from that is the power of really focusing on how to become adaptable. And that's what Grey Consulting helps its clients do, is that we help clients become stronger and more able to manage uncertainty by thinking more about what's coming around the corner, which is partly about rapid testing techniques, it's partly about scenario planning, but certainly it's about really thinking about how do I become a more adaptable person in life and at work. And we've done some of that work with some friends of ours in a retail bank in Europe, and with some FMCG friends as well. And the second thing we try and do is help people really think about how they can be more flexible and more adaptive, because quite often I think we are subject to a bunch of assumptions about how the world works and how our business works that can actually become quite unhelpful at times. And sometimes we need to really open up the processes that we use and kind of adjust them. And we've shown how resourceful and flexible we can all be in the last few weeks, but actually that's something which you can train for. And I would urge you, if you're not already doing this, to think really hard about when you move back into your home, when you move back into your work home, if you're going to ever go back to an office space, think quite hard about what you're going to bring with you and what you're going to chuck out. You know, what shouldn't make it into the new house when you move back in. If it's the same old, I think you're probably doing it wrong. So we've got a lovely workshop we're working with at the moment, which is how to retain and replicate and remove certain behaviours and facets of the life that you used to lead. So if you're interested in that, give me a shout. Right, enough about Grey Consulting and Hyper Ireland. I want to introduce our three speakers to you, and this is in the order they're going to speak tonight. The first is Ben Page. Ben, I'll do a little intro into you, and then if you're happy, you can then launch into telling us a little bit more about yourself. Does that make sense? Where's it gone?
Yep. Okay. Happy to do that.
So Ben is the Chief Executive of Ipsos MORI. I'd love to hear a bit more about the times you've spent advising Downing Street in the Cabinet Office, and also about your visiting professorship at King's College London. I mean, you've got a great and very erudite background, so I'm excited to have you on the show as well, on the event, the show. Harry Davies is Head of Analytics and Measurement at Google. He's worked at Amazon before. He's been a judge of the Marketing Research Society. He's, I think, started out at the Department of Work and Pensions in what was then called e-communications, which seems very relevant today. And I believe, Ben, Harry, you're studying for a PhD in data quality for marketing effectiveness, or words to that effect. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that in a moment.
Yep.
And then finally, thank you. And finally, Margaret Heffernan is, has been a TED speaker, is the chief executive, has run a bunch of companies in media and technology. She's made documentaries. She's been a business school teacher. She's written for the FT. I heard her on the radio a few times, and she's author of a recent book called Uncharted, How to Navigate the Future. So Margaret will be on stream shortly to tell us a little bit more about that book and her point of view. Yeah, makes sense? So if everyone's happy, Ben, tell us a bit more about yourself. I
don't know. I've been at Ipsos MORI for 33 years this summer. We're just all about understanding why humans do what they do. And we do all sorts of things. Some things you'll think that we do political opinion polling, and obviously that's what we're best known for among, certainly among the general public, but that's about 0.1% of our work. And we use hundreds of different techniques to understand people. So whether it's sensors, we work out the value of 460,000 poster sites in Britain by tracking GPS signals. We make virtual reality videos with the Royal Shakespeare Company to understand how people react to different stimuli. So we do lots of different things, but ultimately we're about what people think and what they do. And we work for Harry, but we also work for a lot of smaller companies, FMCG, you name it, across the economy. We're about 19,000 people globally, about 1,500 in London. So, and my job is to try and work out what's going to happen next for the business, which is what we're about to talk about tonight. I mean, the first thing, I'll say it so that Margaret doesn't have to say it. Do buy Margaret's book, Uncharted, because it's an excellent read, and anybody on the call who doesn't like it can buy it and send it to me, and I'll pay twice what they paid for it, because it is a great read, and it takes in the history of predictions. And many people on the call will have read Philip Tetlock's books on forecasting and super forecasting, and obviously they show that most predictions are wrong. But I think there are some things we do know. So the main thing is to narrow down your areas of uncertainty and to be more aware of those, and also what may not to get. I think at times like this, we get a bit excited about, because things have changed very dramatically in a few weeks, we think everything's going to change. The world is going to have a reset and work out how it's going to be greener and cleaner and more democratic, and government's finally going to intervene, and all the rest of it. And the evidence is that even with the sort of events that we're going through now, which will have aftershocks that will last for some years potentially, it will be some time before the full impacts of what we're living through at the moment become visible. I mean, the populism of the last few years, to me, can be traced back to 2008, or indeed before that. And so, I think we need to be cautious. But demography is pretty clear. I mean, and even with the COVID-19 deaths, there are going to be more Nigerians than Americans very soon. We know that the Italians aren't replacing their population fast enough. We know that Europe will be the oldest continent on Earth. We know that tech will keep evolving, and we've just had a massive digital acceleration, and the impacts of that are already, starting to become clearer. So I think it's very important to look at the known knowns, look at what's happening in human society, and look at signals that we can see. The signals are erupting all around us, and the questions are, which of those are going to be sort of permanent changes, or which of them were just, just temporary things. But I do think the other point is that human values, do you believe in God? Is it okay for gay people to get married? What about hanging people if they commit serious crimes? Those sort of things don't change anywhere near as rapidly as we might think. And I was just looking at some things like feeling overwhelmed by technology. And there's been no change in the proportion of people in Britain who feel overwhelmed by technology in the last 20 years. So internet penetration's gone from 13% to 93%. And here we are on Zoom and spending all our time looking at screens, literally, and the proportion feeling overwhelmed by technology hasn't changed at all. So we do need to, the proportion of people who think it's okay to be gay has risen dramatically. The proportion who think it's okay to take drugs has risen dramatically. The proportion who think it's wrong to have adulterous relationships hasn't changed at all. So I think, so look at the known knowns. Look at the weather. Climate change will happen. We can tell you that. Yeah. Almost 96% of scientists agree. Yeah. But I think we do need to be careful about. We're a few months into this, and we're already all doing our hot takes on what the world will be like in 18 months' time. Governments are doing things now that three months ago they would never have dreamt that they would be doing. And it's funny, I'm on a board which looks at basically poverty and how people use debt and credit cards. And we had a call today with I won't mention the organization. And of course, I was saying, well, it's perfectly possible that the government could set up a bank at virtually zero interest rates and just lend people money. And they're going, don't be ridiculous. That's never going to happen. I'm like, well, hang on a minute. The government's currently paying about a quarter of the private sector population's wages in Britain and across Europe. So, you know, I think we just don't know, particularly if there was a second peak to the virus, which is now, I think, the really, as well as all of the economic effects from the fallout of the first wave of the virus, if there was a second peak, you know, all bets are off, quite frankly. I think that's probably enough from me to be going on with.
No, that's very good. I mean, do you think, Ben, given what you've just said about there's immutable things that aren't changing, like values, and then there's some stuff which that seemed impossible and suddenly become possible, like the government lending money to businesses. Do you think, though, given, I guess, you know, you've been working at Ipsos for a while, 10 years ago, if this had happened to us, would we have been any better at predicting what was coming next than we are now?
No, and there's a whole series of biases that we're all subject to that mean that Bill Gates, there's a marvelous TED talk, I think, from Bill Gates in 2015 where he predicts, you know, pandemic. But there's all sorts of reasons why we ignore things that are difficult and, you know, choose the evidence that suits our prejudices or our immediate challenges. So I think one thing from this may be, but I mean, there was a lot of this written after 2008, of course, is that we build in more resilience to organizations, to countries. We move from just in time to just in case, you know, but as humanity, we tend to always be fighting the last war. And, you know, we seem to be, you know, whether we learn permanently is an interesting one.
So that means, Ben, if you're saying it's not much better now than it was, we're not much better at predicting now than we were 10 years ago, and I buy the point about human biases, which we're all subject to. What does that mean for all that big explosion of data that's supposed to make everything entirely predictable and manageable? And
Harry's better placed to answer that.
We will go for him with it in a minute.
But I love I think it's a quote from somebody at Google about big, you know, we used to talk about big data and now we talk, I don't know what we talk about now, but we talk about something else, you know. We've got a new thing, AI. Until recently it was AI was going to fix everything, or for a few lunatics it's blockchain. You know, I thought that great quote, you know, AI, you know, big data is like teenage sex. There is eager anticipation until it's first, you know, until it's first attempted, when there is often disappointment. And, you know, that's the challenge. And it may be that we will fix a lot of things and we will know more. But what we're learning, of course, is complexity. I mean, I think when we say that we're bad at predicting, I do think people have got the spread of behavioral science over the popularization of behavioral science over the last 20 years has made us more aware of, I think we're certainly aware of human irrationality, but it doesn't seem to make us better at predicting things.
No, so everyone's got the book. In fact, we're back behind.
Of course, yeah, of course.
And then we ignore it, in fact. I mean, don't even spot, we are totally unable to spot our own assumptions.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge.
Now, I think it would be a missed opportunity, Ben, if I didn't ask you a bit about polling, just because, you know, why
Sure.
not?
Well, polling can be very accurate on the sort of early in the week, just before a general election. So in May last year, we were accurate to 0.7% for each party in the European elections. And I'm glad you asked me this, Leo. And in December, we were accurate to 0.3% for each party's share of the vote on the Tuesday before the election. But we do have to get quite close to get that accurate.
So why is that? Because when I grew up, I think I got the impression when I was younger that, you know, that we took more store in polls with a longer lead time before the result. Did something change? Why is that happening?
Well, I think it used to be said that nothing, you know, campaigns change nothing. And the evidence I would previously have given you to show you that would be the 2010 general election, when the result after a month of campaigning was about the same as the opinion polls 1 month before the campaign began, even though, for those of you who were around in 2010 in British politics, there was a Nick Clegg effect, and during the campaign, and everything seemed to be up in the air. And then at the end, as the dust settled, it was exactly where it was a month before. But that used to be said. I think events in both America and Britain, and I'm sure in other countries, have suggested now that campaigns really can make a difference. The referendum campaign made a huge difference. And in the 2017 election in Britain, of course, Jeremy Corbyn didn't win, but he did much better than he would have been predicted at the start of the campaign. So campaigns do now seem to switch things, and some of that a part of that may be the sort of speed of information, social media, etc. So things are a bit more volatile. Political loyalties are less baked in. So, you know, so that's why polls, you really want to get one as close as possible to the event, but to be absolutely sure.
Accurate figure, yeah.
We saw Corbyn started rising in the polls throughout the campaign during 2017. It's just that people like me at the beginning of the campaign looked at his numbers and said, there's no way you can get anywhere near her. And obviously he did.
So one of the things that I read about we've read about in the US, I think the author is Seth Stevens-Davidovich. You may have heard him already.
Everybody lies.
And that's right. It talks about digital truth serum, so that, we might lie to a pollster or someone doing a survey about our buying choices or our voting choices, but that if we're showing ourselves to be more open to racist jokes, for example, online, that's a better predictor. And I think it was correlated with they were able to predict more tightly that where Trump would win and where he wouldn't. What do you feel about that and what it means for the forecasting industry?
Sure. I mean, I think most of at every election, there's somebody will pop up and say, look, I've managed to brilliantly predict it on Twitter or I've used this tool that looked at, I don't know, who filled in, what sort of searches are there or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only thing I'd say is that they don't tend to do that consistently at every election. And so it's fine, everybody coming back with a sort of black box technique or something, we've found in the end there are always challenges. But I think what I would say is that in terms of opinion polling, you've got to remember that half our work now is not about asking questions. It's about sometimes just observing people. We increased sales of pet food in Brazil for Mars by about 60%, not by asking any questions, but just by hanging out with Brazilians and looking at how they related to their pets. And that didn't involve any questions. So I think it's very important, and this is another key point that I'm sure Margaret and Harry will come to perhaps. You don't want just surveys, you want all the other information that you can triangulate. And I think one thing the Tetlock books are very good at are that some of the most accurate people, of course, are people weighing up lots of different sources of information where they personally don't have an axe to grind or don't benefit from any particular decision one way or the other. And they turn out to be more accurate than perhaps people like me who's trying to predict what's going to happen to my industry or something. Yes, right. Or how do I personally make money out of this?
Is this what they call super forecasters?
That's the sort of general thread of the super forecasting book.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting view. I'd be interested to understand whether we think they are good at what they do or relative to anyone else. I was going to ask you, and this is I guess this is a playful question really, Ben, but if let's imagine you're called into the cabinet office shortly, maybe
sure.
And you're asked to predict now how things are going to look once this is all settled down. Let's call it 2023 or something like that. So give ourselves a chance to have a second spike, perhaps. What do you think? How do you think our world will be different?
Well, I think at the moment it looks most likely that it's going to take some time for the economy to get back, for the levels of activity to get back to where they were last year. Hopefully I'm wrong, but my cautious prediction is that it is not an immediate recovery. And I say that looking at our numbers in 2000. When you look at the UK economy in 2008, it went down 4% in 1 year. The recovery the next year it took 2 or 3 years to get back to where it was. So that's the first prediction. The other is obviously potentially we've seen, particularly with the disease, you've seen that there is a risk that people will be cautious about the disease and about their own jobs. We've got 2/3 of people worried about losing their jobs, which has a knock-on effect to whatever sort of recovery you try and engineer. People are cautious, and we're seeing that in China at the moment.
Yes,
I think there is an effect of home working where I've just closed our Oxford office because the lease expired. Everybody was working at home. We were thinking about what to do with the business there anyway. And so I think, nobody is going to be renting new office space at the moment. And a lot of people have discovered that they can run their knowledge business. Britain is 80% services. They can run it from home.
Yeah.
You can see all sorts of implications on that for less commuting. Even before this crisis began, Unilever was selling less deodorant because people were washing less because they were working at home and not dressing up to go to work. London Transport for London was seeing falling rider numbers because more people were working at home and commuting. And all of that stuff has just been given a massive acceleration. And so there will be lots of young people who might be thinking about struggling to buy property somewhere in a big city. And now they can live 2 hours out, they can work from home most of the time, and they can go in for meetings occasionally. And so how we use our offices, our patterns of commuting, it's not a fundamental change because we were already doing it before, but the virus has forced loads of people to use Zoom for the first time. It's forced loads of people to try online shopping and online banking for the first time. and actually some of those behaviors probably will stick. So that would be my other prediction. And the other one is the role of the state, because the governments all over the world are now massively interventionist in a way that most of them never imagined. And the question, we'll see this much more quickly, but if the economy does not pick up as we come out of lockdown, will you see massive unemployment, and will that be acceptable to people? Or will you see governments very rapidly either doing helicopter money, and people have started mentioning universal basic income in the questions, or do you see governments doing things like, putting people to work on house building or all of the other sort of infrastructure and services that we need? I mean, I think it would have been unthinkable a year ago, but now, who knows?
I think that's fascinating. I spoke to someone who asked me a great question today, which is, if a bell was rung right now and you could go out straight away and do whatever you want, it's over, the thing is done, it's out. And by the way, that threw me, that question, which I think is an indication of this.
Oh no, I know exactly what I'd do.
I involved going to a pub, actually. And I think, but I was talking about the sort of sense that one of the things that's perhaps missing is that sense of conviviality that you get in a normal life. So not just meeting your friends in the pub or going around someone's house for dinner, but being around other people also having fun. And that kind of experience in life has vanished. And I do wonder whether there'll be a need to sort of put that back into society, particularly when pubs don't open or bars don't open till the very end. So thank you, Ben. That's been a brilliant. I will come back to you a little bit, and we'll get your questions and allow the others to ask you some questions as we go. But I'm going to move on to Harry. Harry, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi.
How you doing? So, Harry, I thought you. I've got a bit of an echo, so I'm going to turn my screen down a little bit. Harry, what do you think about what Ben was saying around the balance between whether it's harder or not to predict now than it was 10 years, the world now than it was, say, 10 years ago?
So I think harder is an interesting question. I think we're definitely better at prediction from a technical point of view. Like if you think about, say, credit card fraud, back in the 1990s, we could predict about 80% of we could recognize about 80% of fraudulent transactions. So a bank could recognize about 80%. About 10 years ago, that was up to about 95%, and now we're at this at 98 to 99% of transactions that we can recognize as fraudulent as they come in. So we have got technically better at prediction. But in order to be good at prediction, basically all prediction is looking at one bit of information and then working out a piece of information that you don't have. So if you have a piece of information, can you use that to generate a piece of information that you don't know? And quite often we're good at, as Ben put it, the known knowns. We're very good at predicting things that are limited in scope, that we know that we don't know. So the things that we have a lot of data for, or a lot of information for, we can understand that data and then we can say, okay, we think this is going to happen next. So things like understanding whether we need to reply to an email quickly or we can archive it. Those sort of things we're pretty good at predicting. We can understand the language in it with machines, and we can decide before it gets to your inbox, should it go into the unimportant stuff in the bottom half of the email or the thing that comes to the top of the inbox. And we see that sort of prediction happening all the time. And I think where that needs, and that kind of prediction, that the technology that that enables that, the maths actually is quite old, but the ability to do that maths at scale has become much easier because it's become much cheaper. We've got much more power to do that. But then what we need to think about is, do we have the right information in order to make predictions that are realistic? Now, the sort of predictions that tend to be discussed in the media and Ben was just talking about, they are really big, complicated predictions. Like, they are insanely complicated, because if you think about something like the economy, there are so many different levers. Having perfect information about an economy is not something that's possible. So being able to predict the economy is impossible. And therefore, and I've seen some nice charts presented by Ben in the past about looking at US predictions for GDP, where the GDP is doing this and the prediction does this sort of nice, neat line that goes up and to the right, and it never happens because something unexpected happens. And I think that's where we're not very good at predicting, and we try to get involved in that because it's interesting, it's exciting, it feels like it's really powerful. But actually making much smaller micro predictions is probably much more helpful. And if I'm a business thinking about what are the things that if I can predict these things much better, I will be able to act faster and work faster. But prediction is only that sort of first layer of it. I mean, in the work that I do, we're prediction practitioners, as it were. So we're looking at lots and lots of data and trying to work out what we should do with that. But that sort of area, you don't want to get too big. Like, we got asked a question last week, does this pandemic mean that we're going to have another baby boom? So we started looking at some of it. And so we had a look at the contraception searches. Like, are people searching for contraception? And the answer was no, far fewer people are searching for contraception. And when we told the sales team that was interested in this, lots and lots of people are not searching for contraception. They went, oh, this is amazing. There's going to be a baby boom. We should put that on a slide. And we said, no. It is very difficult to have sex when you're socially distancing. The reason that people are not searching for contraception is because it's very hard to have sex when you're 2 meters away from someone.
Yeah.
Now, we then started looking at, well, what about pregnancy tests? And there's a slight increase in pregnancy test searches. So potentially there might be a little bump because there's slightly more. Ben was saying that people are claiming, I think the stat that he mentioned when we were chatting earlier was 8% of people are saying they're having sex more. But then that might be a bit similar to artificial intelligence and teenage sex, that people say they're doing it, but no one really is doing it. But it's like that sort of, we went through as many of the different search terms as we could, and we decided there is absolutely no way we can predict this. We can't really say that this is going to lead to more people having children in 9 months' time. But looking at smaller predictions is important. And the interesting thing about what I told you about the sales team jumping to that conclusion is the moment you present anyone with any kind of data that suggests a trend, they start inventing a story. They start telling you what they think is going on.
I was gonna ask you about that. I'm sorry about the echo on my line and yours. I think we have that, but I got a great question was sent in by one of the people attending tonight, which was about an author called David Weinberger, who's written a book called The Clue Train Manifesto, kind of kicked off internet business back in the days. And he apparently made the point in a recent interview that machine learning shows us that we can predict, actually, but sometimes the causal factors are so complex and interconnected that we can't explain. So I'm quite interested in that thing, which is that, we can maybe predict, but we can't understand what's causing that to happen or understand that. And I wonder what that means then for our ability to actually make sense of a strategy, then to take advantage of what we're seeing when we're trying to kind of unpick something which is just too complex for us to really understand the drivers of.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea of if you can't understand how the prediction has been made and you don't know why that's the case, can you make a decision? And I'd say we probably can make a decision, because if you're predicting something, the very next step is to decide what to do about that prediction. So if the outcome is useful, then yes, you can make a decision. So if you're trying to understand if you're able to predict whether someone is more likely to buy something from you if you show them an advert versus send them a letter, then you know what to do. You can make that kind of decision. So you do have that. I think where the strategy comes in is, what do you point your predictions at? Like, what do you try and predict? So what is the thing that's costing you a lot of money to predict at the moment, because you've got lots of people doing it, that you can then, by speeding that up, a good example is Ocado. Ocado received lots and lots of messages from their customers, some of which are, thank you very much, it was a lovely service and the driver was really nice. At the other end of the scale is, my delivery hasn't come and I'm going out, please can you redeliver it tomorrow? Now, thank you very much, the delivery driver was really nice, is not something that's urgent to respond to. I'm about to go out, please can I get my delivery tomorrow, is quite urgent. You need to tell the driver, you need to reroute it. They were able to read all of their emails with a machine and understand whether it needed to be triaged quickly or whether it didn't need to be triaged quickly. And so they were able to prioritize what they worked on, which massively increased their effectiveness, and they were able to reduce the number of people answering emails as a result.
So I like what you say about working out what you try to predict, and I guess what you don't. In your opinion, I guess it's maybe to do partly covered by some of your PhD, but do you think businesses use data to predict properly? And if not, what should they be doing differently?
I don't think there's a sweeping answer to that question. Some do, some don't. I think what's quite interesting is the flow of information, because kind of at the doer level, the individual contributors in companies that are using, particularly within, they are making good decisions based on the data they've got and what they can predict with that. They're using good tools in a lot of cases. Where it becomes more problematic is where you then have to make slightly larger corporate decisions, and the process of information management tends to reach a stage now where you've got relatively good decision making quite close to actions being taken, tasks. As that bubbles up, and I'm sure everybody on the call has had this experience, that then some kind of personal storytelling takes over in the decision making. So one of the analysts that works for me sends me a report, I read that report, find the salient 5 or 6 points that I think are really important to make a decision. I then turn that into a shiny PowerPoint that I present to a group of people, that then eventually becomes a line on a spreadsheet for a board to make a decision. They don't have that full information. So I think that flow of information and being able to understand it is edited constantly by humans, and sometimes in that process their own agendas take over versus the right answer or doing the right thing with the information. So I think it's very difficult to get to a point where a large organization can use information in a very objective way.
I mean, that's fascinating. And again, it's a bit like with Ben's conversations about the human biases, the influence of the humans in the flow of information and the accuracy or the way predictions or data are being interpreted, I think is fascinating. And that sort of leads me on, I guess, to perhaps my final question for now, and then we'll come back later, Harry, but what do you think are the biggest blockers that we have to us having a better view of the future? I didn't prepare you for that one, so I'm just chucking it out.
The biggest blockers. So I think it's universal access to information is probably the biggest blocker. So when Ben was talking about polling, and he was saying, we can predict very close to an election. What is also the case is there's a lot more money going into collecting the data very close to an election, because data is quite expensive. So that being able to collect really clean data at the right point costs a lot of money. And then there was an interesting comment on the chat, which was just biases. There is a lot of bias in a lot of data collection and in a lot of data. And that can then give you very, very complicated answers to, it can really mess up what you're doing. So you design something that you consider to be relatively unbiased in making a decision, and that's questionable in itself because it's humans designing those things. But then you then pass it a load of biased data, which gives you a biased answer. It looks like the right answer, but that could well be because there has always been bias in that area. So I think clean data is probably the most difficult thing at the moment, because that's really expensive. And there's a lot of data around. Like, you can look at a load of data, but that data isn't unbiased in any stretch. And being able to get unbiased data means that you need to really understand your data collection methods. I think probably Ben could talk for hours on how do you make sure that you've got a representative sample? How do you weight that sample? Like, this is true of all data. Like, if you look at, okay, all of these people buy this particular type of shoe, you may not be able to use that data to predict whether they're going to buy the pair of trousers off you as well. There's a lot of bias in a lot of data, and that hasn't been helped. I mean, like, all of the recent regulation I fully support, but things like cookie consent and the general data protection regulations means that it becomes more difficult to collect data at scale, which is good because it protects people's privacy, but it doesn't protect people's privacy evenly, because people need to have read all of the information and be informed to make that consent. And some people just click the boxes to get rid of the things on their screen. And so you will end up having bias within that data as well, which then requires a heavy level of modeling.
So am I off mute? Yes. I'm going to ask you the same question that I finished up with Ben, which is, it more or less, if you were asked, and I know you kind of have argued for the power of micro prediction rather than macro prediction, but nonetheless, I'm going to appeal to your human side, Harry, and I'm going to say, if you had to make some kind of guess or prediction for what the world might be like in 23, what we might be experiencing, what comes to mind for you?
And there's a recency bias with this, because I was looking at some information about people's searching behavior within finance and services today. I suspect there will be fewer bank branches, because we've seen a very large increase in online banking searching. So I think that it will be likely that banks will rely heavily on online banking, more so than they do today. We've also seen that in areas of the country, which is unusual. So rural and deprived areas have been searching a lot more than all the growth for online banking is in rural and deprived areas, because basically well-off people already do online banking. I think the other interesting thing will be an acceleration of a cashless society. You know, the amount of searching for contactless payment and how to do it is remarkable at the moment. I don't think we'll all become hairdressers though, which there has been a very large increase in that. I'm not sure about, I think there's, it's interesting. We were looking at searches for like home office stuff, and I'm not convinced that we'll all work from home more. I think that may well, there's reasons we work in offices and they haven't fully gone away yet. And certainly I'm not going to be, because I haven't got an office.
I understand. So Harry, stay with us, because I think we'll. I'm sure there'll be people who want to ask a couple of questions in a minute after we've spoken to Margaret. And thank you for your answers and your honest chat. Margaret, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hooray! How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So you had a chance to listen to, hopefully, to what Ben and Harry were saying. But I mean, I'm going to go straight for it, really, Margaret. And if anyone people can read your book, Uncharted, and you can tell us a bit about it as we go. But should we go along with, I'll say this politely, but a Silicon Valley view that there's lots of wonderful data now that didn't used to exist, and therefore that makes humans highly predictable? Or should we not? And if not, why not?
Well, I think we shouldn't, partly for all the reasons that you've just heard. I think, I ran tech companies in the 90s, and a very big part of the promise was we're going to have all this data, and then we'll be able to predict all this stuff, and then it'll be fabulous. We'll be able to predict what people are going to buy and send it to them before they knew that they wanted it, and it'll all be marvelous, and we'll make tons of money. Mm-hmm. And I think, in fact, what's happened is that as we've aggregated vast amounts of data and tried to do that, it's become clear all of the problems, that we've just heard about and more. And actually what you're seeing in Silicon Valley now instead is a drive towards, let's just find a way of getting people to behave the way we want them to, because since we can't predict it, the best thing is to nudge them or force them towards behaviors that we want. Hence Amazon patenting a anticipatory shopping algorithm, so that they can send us what they think we want before we know we want it, on the understanding that, of course, everybody's going to be kind of too bothered to return it. The first few things will be free. And so we just get into the habit of accepting what we're told by our digital masters. I think what's really interesting about that, apart from the fact that it's obviously abusive and loathsome, is that it is a quiet concession that all this data didn't lead to accurate prediction. I mean, I've lost track of how many times Amazon tries to persuade me to buy the books that I've written. So it's, it seemed like it was going to be a really solvable problem, and it turns out that human beings change a lot, that you may be able to identify a gross cohort of individuals that generally behave the same way, but when you try to get it down to the granular individual, it all kind of falls apart, that human beings are really complex. And so you have to decide, well, can you live with that, or do you want to try to force fit a model of behavior onto people, which is clearly one very powerful argument at work in Silicon Valley? Or do you decide, well, actually, we need to adopt a different, more complex and subtle model for humanity?
Do you think, like, for whether it's for business leaders, Margaret, for business leaders, or for people working in health services or governments, that if we take that to the conclusion that it's very hard to predict, actually, and you need to be dealing with you have to be able to cope with a much more a high degree of complexity in the world, where does that leave those people in the jobs they have to do, some of which are important, some of which are just selling products, but what does that mean for the person at the other end having to sort of make decisions about the world?
Well, it means it's a great deal harder. It means it's a great deal harder. I think it also, it leaves us in a position where when people start making these sweeping forecasts about what we're going to be able to do, we need, first of all, to ask who are they and why are they saying it? Because I think, one of the things that I learned in the course of writing my book is I would say, and this is accurate to predict, as accurate as a wild ass guess. I would say at least 80% of forecasts are really propaganda. They are people saying what they want to happen.
Yes.
So when everybody says, well, post-pandemic, we're all going to be fabulously green and the whole world's going to be changed, that's because of what they want. And when other people say, and I've heard both of these arguments in the last 24 hours, what we're going to need is really forceful leadership, and people have to understand they are going to be monitored and tracked forever because that is the future. That's propaganda too, because that's what those people or companies want, and that's where they see their money to be made. you know, by the same degree, you know, people who say, well, you know, we're going to be able to have personalized medicine because with all of our understanding of genomics, we're going to know everything about people's future, which is what people like Robert Plomin argue. You know, we have to understand, you know, this is a kind of propaganda too about the importance of genetics. And we have to learn to step back and say, well, hang on a second. Hang on, if DNA were totally predictive of human life, then identical twins would have identical medical profiles, and they don't. If one twin has multiple sclerosis, the other one should have a 100% chance of getting multiple sclerosis, but they don't. They have a 30% chance. If one identical twin has breast cancer, the chances of the other twin getting it are 15%. You know, there is ineradicable uncertainty in human life. And I think instead of trying to force fit it into some kind of authoritarian model that makes everybody much easier to manipulate, we actually ought to stand back for a second and realize that in this diversity lies robustness. Evolution prizes diversity because it gives us resilience. The minute differences between human beings are the glory of the human race, not a bug to be fixed.
I love that, and I think we'll come back to it at the end because I think that's probably quite an uplifting way to end our section together. But I think one of the things that's interesting is then is if this complexity is all around us and it escapes most people's ability to actually get a handle on it properly. I mean, is there anyone you think, either individuals or institutions or even perhaps national cultures, are there people who are better at it than others, better at working with that complexity and coming up with smart conclusions? Who should we look to as the leading lights of tomorrow in that respect?
Well, I think Ben's fantastic at it, you know, not least because he starts from the premise that there's a lot of stuff that isn't predictable. And he understands that there are parameters to prediction, which is the closer you get to the event, the more precise you can be. In the same way that GPS is very good at telling me how long it's going to take me to walk to the post office, absolute rubbish at telling me how long it's going to take to drive to North Wales, right? A short journey is easy, a long journey is, you know, very difficult. A very long journey is even more difficult. So I think people who understand the limitations of prediction are very good. I mean, what Tetlock says is they're open-minded people. They constantly are reviewing and revising their prediction, and they understand probability, which is no forecast has 100% probability. So there is always a margin for error. There's always got to be a margin for uncertainty. And that in circles where this stuff matters, like in the intelligence community, that's how forecasts are always presented. The difficulty is that by and large, politicians don't want to look at the probability, they want to look at uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to understand the future, we have to be more comfortable with uncertainty. Now, I think, and this may come as a bit of a surprise, I suppose, I think some of the people who understand this better than anybody are artists. Artists absolutely live in uncertainty because they understand that in uncertainty is the opportunity to do something new. They choose highly uncertain lives. They spend a huge amount of their time, and I'm talking about, you know, writers, painters, musicians, absorbing data in a way that feels and it looks very inchoate. It's definitely not the way that Google does it, but they are super sensors. They're absorbing stuff a lot. They're distilling it and making something out of it that often resonates in a way that nobody could have planned. And they change before they have to. Mm. So I think there's a lot about the way that artists experience life, that even though we can't all be artists, we could learn a lot from. We tend, you know, in the kind of prevailing business ethos and the economic ethos, which has kind of eaten our brains in the last couple of decades, has really tried to turn us into efficient self-maximizers, you know, being very planned and very disciplined and only paying attention to the stuff that matters and so on. And that's how we miss stuff. I mean, I wrote a whole book on this, obviously, called Woeful Blindness. But it's actually that in allowing your mind to wander, in looking very broadly, in opening the most complex thing in the known universe, which is your brain, to the full experience of human life, you pick up more than when you're simply, with tunnel vision focused on your goal. Now, I'm not saying you spend your whole life kind of wandering in a daze, but I think we need to learn better how to toggle between these two ways of living, because they both offer us phenomenal opportunities to see new things. I mean, people tease me a lot about my book because, the first third of it argues against our ability to forecast. And then it's full of things like pandemics. And they say, well, come on, Margaret, you don't believe in forecasting. And look what you just did. Your book came out like 2 weeks before the shutdown. But that's because I always look at stuff that's always there. Pandemics are always there. That we can't predict what or where or when, but they're always there, in the same way that willful blindness is always there. So I think we need to get a little bit less dazzled by what's all the new stuff and start thinking about what's the relationship between the perennial and the episodic and the accidental, because all of those things are innate in human existence.
I like the point you made about the artist, and that would appeal to someone like me, I guess, from my background. And I've heard some people say that forecasting, as it's called in some circles, but thinking about the future is really a creative act, not really a science. And certainly if you think about people that we used to see a bit more in public culture, like Faith Popcorn, it was almost like a show, performative act about describing a future. And it was perhaps a hope to describe a future that by describing it, it would come into being. In a way you can.
But I think, what interests me about artists is how is it that they're able to do work that isn't just relevant when it appears, it's relevant 10, 20, 50, 100, 150, 200 years later. That's what really interests me. Because that isn't forecasting, and it's not doing this stupid thing called future proofing. It's really thinking in a different way about what's going on in the world that I inhabit and what themes can I pull from it. And you very often find artists writing pieces of music or works of art that somehow just hit the moment. And this is not about planning, it's not about forecasting, it's about being in tune with the world that you inhabit. I think it's kind of interesting, for example, I've written a lot about, in the chapter on artists, I've written a lot about how almost every artist that I interview or have worked with, walks. They just walk and look and walk and look. And so does Andy Haldane when he's trying to think about interest rates. I think there's just a different way of being that isn't to the exclusion of planning and knowledge and data and so on, but it absolutely is a vital companion piece. And we lose a lot of resilience when we cut that out of our lives and out of our thinking.
Yeah. I really love that. And in your book, you talked about cathedral projects, I think. So long-term projects that were done in the past where there was a kind of many, many, many years till the outcome was finally realized, and in a perhaps an unknown future. Do you think we're still able to do that kind of thinking and working now?
We absolutely do still do them. I mean, the point about a cathedral project is it is started by people who know they won't live to see its completion. And there is no end date for it. So in that respect, they're very different from mega projects. So if you think of the great Gothic cathedrals of Western Europe, these don't have architects. They are started and led primarily by stonemasons who know they won't be able to see it finished and who know that it will evolve over time. And so they have built into them a kind of elasticity and adaptability that I think we have a lot to learn from. Now, the modern day cathedral projects that I've written about include CERN and the Human Genome Project, and of course, an actual cathedral, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And when you look at how those institutions have been run over time, they are, coming back to your opening point, they are tremendously adaptable. They have guiding principles, so they know what they're there for, but that's pretty much it. They don't have rules and regs about how to move according to those guiding principles. The Human Genome Project, for example, doesn't do scientific management. They don't have KPIs and targets and all of that kind of nonsense. When a good idea comes up, if it seems relevant and doable, they do it. Equally with CERN, they're very, very driven by what are the ideas that emerge in the course of their experiments and what's possible to do today that might not have been possible to do yesterday. The Sagrada Familia keeps going and might, touch wood, maybe, be finished 100 years after Gaudi's death because people believed in it. And this is a really profound characteristic of cathedral projects, which is they have a broad base of support that keeps them going even as they change. And I think, this really led me to think that a key part of adaptability is being able to maintain legitimacy. And legitimacy means that people understand the worth of the work. And I think from the business environment, I think this will be and is a very dominant emerging theme, which is who says what you're doing with the world, with people, with the environment is worth doing. And if we want to have long-term thinking and institutions that last long-term, they need to have the guiding principles that allow them to be adaptable, but they also need constantly to focus on the broad base of support that makes them legitimate, because without that, they become irrelevant and they lose their license to operate.
I love it. I've hogged you for too long, Margaret, and I think what I might like to do is allow some other smart people who are chatting away in the group chat on the side and asking clever things to throw some questions to the three of our speakers tonight. So what I'd like to do, and this will put pressure on poor Nick Bennett from Hyper Island to help figure this one out, but what I'd like to do is say, if you'd like to ask a question to any of our speakers, or even to all three of them, what I'd love you to do is type your question in the Zoom group chat, or even just raise your hand and say, I have a question, and I'd love to get you on video, see some other fresh faces, some smiley faces, and get you guys to pose your questions. Who's got something? If not, we'll speak amongst ourselves for another 10 minutes and finish, but I can go back through the feed. I'm going to wait because I'm sure someone is wildly typing. Amy, you've been quite chatty in the chat. Do you want to come and say hi on screen, if we can find you? You've got no mic. It might be we can unmute you. But I guess we'll wait. I guess if we can't get Amy on screen, we'll let's ask the question. And I think this is quite interesting. Can people learn from history? Because so much of the conversation tonight has been about extrapolating from the past.
So I think the thing about learning from history is really fascinating. People think history repeats itself. Ben's a historian, so he understands this. History does not repeat itself. It's one of the worst understood ideas really ever. And the main reason it doesn't repeat itself is because progress occurs because of new knowledge, which is intrinsically unpredictable. So what we are learning today about pandemics is new knowledge for us, which we didn't have when we were might have been trying to predict this. So the difficulty with people believing that history repeats itself is that they tend to seize on analogies and think that what happened here will happen there. The poster child for this is the Maginot Line, with France thinking, well, we're going to be invaded by Germany in exactly the same place. Kind of forgetting that when they built this monstrosity, the Germans could see them, so they just took a different route. There was new knowledge in the system, which they hadn't really catered for. There's a really tragic, another epidemic story, which is in 1976. There was a huge flu scare in the United States. And the CDC under David Sensor kind of rushed into action because everybody always thinks it's going to be like 1918, even though people who work in epidemics have a joke. This is their idea of a joke, which is if you've seen one epidemic, you've seen one epidemic. They're all unique. There's no profile. Anyway, they all get excited. It's going to be like 1918. This is terrible. Rush into action, pass an act of Congress, vaccinate 40 million people. In the end, only one person died of this strain of flu.
Margaret, it's Ben.
Yeah.
I agree, and obviously, but I do think, and maybe it's just because I'm a historian, we can at least, it helps us imagine different scenarios.
Well, so I completely agree with that. The use of history is to see the difference between now and then.
Yeah.
But actually what people mostly gravitate towards is the similarity.
Yeah.
And I think the really sad story about the 76 flu scare is, because it kind of went all so badly wrong, David Sencer was kicked out of the CDC. He then went to New York to be Commissioner of Health, and he saw a new virus emerging and thinking, I don't want to overreact like I did last time, but this time it was AIDS.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
I think there is a problem with the definition.
The important question to ask is what's different, not what's the same.
Yeah. Go on, Harry.
I think there's an even bigger difficulty with the concept of learning from history, in that history is edited and a small amount of information. So, there's so many minority groups that you don't hear, read, or are able to access the history of. Yeah. They're not represented in our canon of history. And so when we talk about learning from history, we're learning from a very small sample of information. And so you then learn what you're learning from, or what you're trying to learn from, is a narrative. And learning from a linear narrative that is an accepted canon of history is problematic, which kind of goes back to the point that prediction is only useful or only possible if you've got really, really good data or really good information. We say data and it kind of sounds like a techie thing, and coding and all of those things, but actually we're talking about information and what happens to people. The moment you limit that by taking a curation of it, you're introducing bias to it. So it's very difficult to learn from things where you don't have complete information of those things.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Harry, because the issue is whose history and whose version of the history.
I'll just defend historians, because some of them, I think at least history has got more democratic over the last 100 years or so, and sort of there's now the sort of school of total history, which is about diet and trying to look at it from different people's perspectives. But yeah, I get the picture. But I think the point about narrative is, and it goes back to something you were saying, Harry, that one of the challenges is this: we get these overwhelming narratives that we all buy into, and our tendency as human beings to like stories and patterns that we can recognize, and they can lead us madly astray. So if anything, the point is to as Margaret's illustrated with artists who have the ability to sort of go off and do something completely different. It is to construct those, I think, which is why scenarios are so helpful, creating different future narratives, and all of which contain elements of truth, none of which will actually happen. But that helps you start to become more resilient by imagining how you might react to that scenario, what you're going to do about it, which then, even if it doesn't happen, you've become stronger by being ready for it.
I completely agree. And I think one of the really interesting issues around scenario planning is the process of doing it well changes people. It changes how they think and what they think. And I think a lot of it is really literally kind of mind-opening. And when it's done badly, it's about trying to find the right one.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether we might ask another question. I got the impression that Sarah, are you on? You might have a question to ask.
Hey, Leo. Thanks, guys. It's been a really good hour. I've got questions for all of you, but I had one that came up immediately from Margaret. I'm hearing a lot this idea of future-proofing, and you just called it a stupid concept. And I'd like to know I'd love you to expand on that a bit, because it's a real buzz at the moment, that kind of phrase.
Yeah. A stupid concept is, of course, a technical phrase, you'll understand. Right? Yes, it's very fashionable, this idea that I'm going to build something which will survive no matter what happens in the future, which presupposes that you know the future, which you don't. And so I think cutting it some slack, at its best, the only way of future-proofing is to think of what might I do just in case. So there's a lot in my book about just in time versus just in case. Just in case says, okay, I think some of these things might happen, or I know some of, if various things happen, like a pandemic or an epidemic crash, or a financial crash, I know the following assets or resources will be really useful. So although it isn't efficient for me to garner and preserve those assets and resources, I'm going to do so just in case. I think that's probably the most valid form of so-called future-proofing. But let's be clear, it is not future-proof, because the future may turn out to be different. So all the things you've thought of may turn out to be wrong. I think at the lunatic end of the scale, it's a sense that if I know everything about everything that's happening, I will be able to anticipate what is coming around the corner. And I think that's absurd. Somewhere in between, I think, is a capacity to understand the nature of complexity, which is that some things are generally certain but specifically ambiguous. So it's generally certain that climate change is real, but we can't predict which forests will go on fire this year or which villages will have floods. It's generally certain there will be future financial crashes. The Bank of England, I think, has been very courageous in acknowledging that, but also saying they don't know when or what will cause it or where it will start. So you can think about you can accept those general certainties, but also have to recognize that specifically the ambiguity is going to stay there. And I think anyone who thinks something's future-proof is denying the ambiguity of the specifics.
Anyone else want to have a go at that question?
No, I mean, I think Margaret's answer is great. And I think it is that point about we're back to being prepared, thinking about different possibilities. I mean, there is a question about, you can build the railway that will never crash, but it will cost, we can guarantee that it will never ever crash, for example. However, it will cost an absolute fortune and only go at 10 miles an hour. So there is an issue. I mean, one of the things that has happened over the last, X years is that we've accepted there are different sorts of risks, and we accept different levels of risk. Sometimes we don't like to consciously talk about it, but I think we're gradually getting better at some of those things, that we aren't prepared to actually build we're not going to build the railway that never crashes, or indeed even potentially, I mean, I'm trying to think, planes don't crash very much, fortunately, but we never make, we aren't prepared to do the things that we tolerate huge amounts of poverty in our societies, given the nature of some of the questions. People say it's bad and unfair and that we should do more things about it, but we never vote to do anything about it. So you have to assume that actually we're prepared to tolerate various things. And I think being more cognizant of some of that and being prepared to look at different scenarios is important. And we're coming on here to whether you're planning the future of a business, your personal future, where we all know we're going to die, but of course we like to ignore the statistics about drinking and eating the wrong things and what that might do. So we just cheerfully ignore those when it comes to ourselves. And whether you're trying to plan, the future of a country or a society, where we get into very different sort of sets of priorities, I guess.
I think one of the funniest things I ever heard, and actually one of the things that sparked my thinking, which led to my book, was a friend of mine who said, if I knew I was going to live to be 95, I'd drink more. it was such a beautiful paradox, right? Because if you drank more, you wouldn't live to be 95. So we're always having to make these adjustments and trade-offs in life. And, you know, and that's the nature of life.
Back to sort of future proofing, which is it's a hideous term that we should probably never use. Like, actually, there's probably a sensible bit of work that all companies should do on a regular basis about looking at where their risks are and how do you reduce your risks. Now, there are a whole bunch of known risks that you can reduce. You can reduce the risk of. So if you think about, as an individual, stopping smoking is a way of reducing your risk of cancer. It's not going to eliminate the risk, but it's a much more nuanced way of, like, future proofing is something that you put on a slide and you have in a shit meeting. Whereas actually thinking through, well, what are the risks, the current risks to our business? What do we think the future risks are going to be to our business? How big are they? And how much do we need to spend to reduce that risk a little bit? And I think if you have good information, you can make good decisions on reducing the risk of some things. Taking out insurance is a way of reducing risk. Or actually, it's a way of selling or buying giving the risk to someone else, paying someone else to have your risk. And so I think there's lots of ways that we should think about de-risking the things that we do. And to do that, you need the best possible prediction that you have at that time. And that's a sensible way of doing it. So I don't think it, as a phrase, it's rubbish, but as a concept of should you reduce the risk? Yes, you should. I mean, it is also down to your business and your own tolerance of risk. I climb rocks. Sometimes I put in protection. Sometimes I don't. And I'm managing risk on a regular basis when I'm doing those things. And I think those thinking about where are the things that we can see the risk coming, like at the moment, we can see an almightily large recession coming. What are the things that we need to do now to reduce our risk? And you see people making investment decisions right now, cutting back on some things, spending more on other things because they know that's coming. So I think there are sensible things that you can do, but I suppose probably in a kind of macro sense, the only future proofing is to invest in education.
Yeah, I mean, I think in education, I think in, you know, aspects of health. I think what's interesting, of course, is risk you can quantify and uncertainty you can't. So so you can, as you say, you can take out insurance, you can do hedging, you know, to deal with quantifiable risk. The uncertainty dangers are much harder to get your head around. And I was interested that, you know, David Spiegelhalter said, you know, even mathematicians find probability difficult to understand. So I think in kind of normal life, you know, this is actually quite hard for people to contemplate. I think the thing in my own life I find useful is because my husband and I always have these arguments about, you know, is the pessimistic future I see going to happen versus the optimistic future that he sees? And this is irresolvable, right? It's a stupid argument, although it's kept us married for a very long time. And in the end, we resolve it by, okay, let's imagine the most pessimistic scenario is valuable or possible. In that case, what would we wish we had done now? What will we wish we had done now? And if that isn't extravagantly expensive, let's do it anyway. What the heck? We know we don't know, but we know that if the worst came to the worst, we might need these things or these capacities, to your point about education. Let's invest in those anyway. And if it's a waste of money and time, so on.
So look, guys, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and do a 2-minute summary of some of the key themes of this evening, and then I'm going to leave you with a question each, the same question for each of you, which is supposed to be an uplifting finale to our soiree or our lunchtime together, depending on where you're tuning in from. So, and it's this: if and it's in Margaret's book really where I've taken this from, but if there's an upside to uncertainty in that it means that not everything is predetermined and predestined, and it creates choice and it creates freedoms and it allows us room for maneuver. My question to the three of you is going to be, what does the current uncertainty create as a wonderful room for maneuver for the future? So I'll leave that question with you while I do a 2-minute summary, and then I'm going to come around and that'll be the end of our session. So I don't know, guys, you've seen the conversation this evening with some extremely bright, very erudite, educated, intelligent and highly expert individuals. And there's no way I can do justice to that, but there is a video recording that I'll circulate via email tomorrow to all of you. I think some of the big themes were, and that stuck with me, one was that the macro is very hard, not least because we just have imperfect information. And it's almost impossible to resolve that. But the micro is a bit easier given time and scale and money and proximity. And maybe that's where it's possible for us to do some expectation of what might be coming next. There are some long-term known knowns, and I think Ben was very clear about this. And I thought it was fascinating to see how some of our values really have not changed over a 20 or 30-year period, even while other things do change. And I also thought I was quite heartened personally by the point that some of the behaviours that we're seeing now will stick. We'll be debating for weeks and months which will stick and which don't, and I think we need data on that. But certainly I wouldn't be surprised that the cautiousness that we've seen in the world who are coming out of the lockdown remains with us both in personal and social and economic terms for a while. I thought it was very interesting though that we can easily overstate what we hope will persist, and I think that's revealed a big thread to me this evening of, and I guess it's obvious really, but the human impact is so crucial in all of this. So our own biases, our ideologies, and of course, our own impact on information flow up and down the line in organizations has a really big impact on our ability to predict anything. And I think it's fascinating how vulnerable those sorts of predictions or even that kind of thinking can be, frankly. And certainly that people project their own desired views out on the world, what Margaret called propaganda, which not only helps us define the past, someone wrote, history is written by the victors, which is true, but also the kind of narratives that we're creating about the future and the kind of world we would hope to see. But I do feel emboldened that we should all spend a bit more time thinking and constructing some scenarios which are about using our imaginative skills a little bit and some of the information that we have to hand to try and think through various ways in which things could pan out to help us plan a little better. I really love, and this is kind of coming to the end of my summary here, I really love the idea that there are certain traits that we could cultivate in ourselves to help us be more open and more ready for dealing with the uncertainty in the world around us. And I think this applies to us as individuals, but also to us collectively as teams and organizations and businesses. But I love the idea of the openness and the self-awareness. And I particularly like the idea of not perhaps being less super forecasters, but super sensors, that phrase you use, I think is brilliant. The idea of the open-minded artist really appeals to me, particularly in a world where so much has been driven towards an empiric and numerical reading of the world, and that being prized above all else. And I particularly like the idea, and I would do perhaps coming from a brand strategy background in my own life, but that if you can combine a guiding principle, somewhere you're heading towards, plus adaptability, and you're lucky enough to earn the legitimacy to be allowed to evolve as things change, and you can be in a wonderful position. I'll shut up now, and I will ask my wonderful, talented speakers to tell me their response to my question. Who'd like to go first?
Remind me of the question.
I can't remember anymore. It was, given that uncertainty creates opportunity, room for maneuver,
okay.
Choice.
I mean, I think the hope, I'm going to, because my hope, but I'm certainly not expecting it necessarily to happen, is that we, somehow we use this this crisis to have a stock take of where we were going on the environment, so that we don't suddenly resume carbon production in the same way that we did in the aftermath of the 2008 recession. I have no guarantee that it will happen, but it's an aspiration. And I think also we learn from some of the steps that were taken after the 2008 crash, which led to actually increased inequality. And again, we try and learn some lessons from that and don't see increased inequality as a result of the of COVID-19. Again, I have no, you know, those are my hopes. Whether they happen or not is quite another matter.
It's going down well in the group chat. Okay, Harry or Margaret?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, that's very uplifting, Ben. And I was thinking in a much more dull way, because what I'm like, there's a couple of things that I think I'm quite excited about. One, that all of this creates a massive amount of variation in how stuff happens. So like, we don't really know. Like we've been asked a lot about, can we work out what are the things that are going to endure from this? And we don't really know.
Yeah.
And there's some signals that we've looked at, but like nothing that we're confident in. And so that uncertainty is quite exciting, because like everything's going to look a little bit different. Like I think a lot of human behaviors will remain the same, but the environment will be very different for business, for people, for like where you can gather and how you think about gathering and how you value different relationships. So I'm very hopeful that that variation is going to be interesting from my own sort of personal practice. I think it's going to be really interesting, because like literally a whole bunch of lines that did have a fairly steady trend and were quite dull have kind of gone crazy, which is really exciting from a sort of analyst point of view. But the other thing that I have no real idea what central London looks like at the moment. And I have this sort of, like, I've been locked away in about a 10-mile radius, which is as far as I can run, to a suburb in North London, which is pretty dull. And I've got this feeling, and it kind of links back to the artist point that Margaret made, that a lot of us will come out of our houses or flats at some point and look at things slightly differently, and our perception will have changed, because we've gone through a very strange experience that's very difficult, and we will look at things differently. Colours may be more vibrant, and that's very exciting.
Thank you, that's really good. Margaret, how about you?
Yeah. I absolutely agree with what Harry says. You know, what changes people is experience, and everyone's having an experience of one kind or another right now. How deep that is and how long it will last is completely unpredictable. I mean, I think, you know, for me, what's hopeful in this uncertainty is, I think, generally speaking, we are having a visceral experience of what a society is, both in its beneficial aspects. You would not have people turning up to work in hospitals if workers in the NHS didn't have some concept of society, of the need to help each other. And we're either seeing that or we're of it. And I think that, you know, if ever there was a moment where it became blazingly true that there is such a thing as society, this is it. At the same time, I think some people, not all of us, are recognizing that that society, which is a thing, is not the same thing for everybody. And so, you know, my hope in all of this is that it kicks off a more thoughtful conversation, not about what party do we want to have in power, not what celebrity do we want to have in power, but actually what kind of society do we want to have.
Thank you. I've just been told by my son that he's just arrived on the scene, clearly indicating that the time has elapsed. The reality of him in about 2 minutes. But he won't come on screen. So listen, I will draw our evening to come and say hi. I will draw our evening to a close there, and I would like to say a deep, heartfelt thanks and appreciation, really, to Ben Page from Ipsos MORI, to Harry Davies from Google, and to Margaret Heffernan, whose book you must all rush out and buy, as Ben said at the beginning. Come and say hi. For taking us on an amazing journey this evening, and a really powerful one. I think I could have talked about this for 3 or 4 more hours. So I shall try and send an email around to everyone tomorrow that summarizes and provide some links to some of the key things that we've talked about. And I hope that you'll tell others how tonight went, and that if you enjoyed it, you encourage them to come to another one. I think we'll wait 2 weeks for the next one and try and get, God, if we can, a topic as interesting and speakers as accomplished as these guys. But stick around and we'll give it a go. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time and energy, and I'll see you all soon. Send me an email. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
You. Why don't you appear? Come into the shop. Come on. Let's see people see you.
Dad, when are you gonna go?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your involvement tonight and for being part of the call. I hope you enjoyed it. And please do drop me a note and an email and about what you enjoyed, what you'd like to hear more about, any other questions you have. We're, it's nice to be connected at the moment, so I'm really happy for that. I'll pop down in a minute.
These two are stuck. I can't kick them out. But everyone else is flatable. I'm not sure if they're frozen or still there.
Yeah.
All good?
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was. How did it feel?